The Valley Current.
My name is Jack Russo. Dr. Leonard Hayflick is with us, and he's going to have some commentary a bit into this because I do want to show some other slides and some other points ahead of this. But in general, Wally has had a big influence in my life. I was lucky enough I was lucky enough to come to law school in California, leave New York. I grew up in New York, but essentially a working class family, made my way eventually to a graduate school in New York, including an MBA from Columbia University and a master's degree in computer science from City University of New York, and made my way to law school on the West Coast and stayed on the West Coast, and was lucky enough to become the next door neighbor to Dr. Bortz. And interestingly, he promoted very early in meeting with me this idea that, hey, you're overweight. You got to start losing weight, Jack. If you want to live to 100, you're going to have to start adopting a healthy lifestyle. And he and I would literally go out, and I'm going to show a few pictures if I can find them, of the stuff we would do together. He and I would go out running. This is a picture of me that was taken years ago. Of course, I looked so fat because I am fat, and that's what I look like. I was fat. I'll explain that in a minute. Because he impressed upon me lifestyle management principles early on. And at that picture, I was close to 300 pounds. He said, come on, Jack, let's go out running. So that's him leaving his driveway in Portola Valley. My driveway is one driveway over. And literally, he's got the computer law group sweatshirt on, where literally I'm taking the pictures, he's running. And literally, he's motivating me very much to adopt lifestyle medicine principles. And that motivation led me to, well, among other things, attracting a very beautiful Stanford graduate who became my wife, Dr. Lee Suter. You know, that's one thing. That's my mom. That's my dad. That's Dr. Hayflick. I don't know what year, Leonard, this picture was taken. That's you in your laboratory. I'm going to guess you're probably in your 30s at that point.
Yes, probably 30s or early 40s.
And that's at the Wistar Institute, right?
That's correct.
And you're going to have, if I'm calculating correctly, you're going to have your 96th birthday in about 5 or 6 months, right?
Correct.
Right. You're 95 and a half or so, and you're living on your own, taking care of yourself, and you've done so for decades.
That is right.
So you're like the best example of going on to what might be called a healthy 100 years.
Well, I hope I reach 100. There is some slight evidence that I might reach that number because my mother died at the age of 106. And I have several attributes that are similar to hers. So I'm hoping that the gene for living to 106 has been passed to me.
Well, 106 is not the outside limit. I mean, we're going to get to this, but you'd think for sure there is an outside limit because that's really what the Hayflick limit is all about, right?
Well, yes, but I don't think the Hayflick limit has anything to do with the aging process directly. I think it has a fair amount to do with longevity determination, but not about aging. Aging is a separate subject.
Okay. So in general, what people should be aware of, well, that's me at the age of 5 or 6. So that's like 6 decades ago, just as a kind of what happens over time is you're a small person, then you get to be big and bigger. And at some point you maybe become too big and you have to do something to, stop that from happening. So part of the motivation for this tribute to Wally is I think he was a very early thinker. His dad, in fact, had also been giving a lot of thought to this topic. but he was a very early thinker on what might be called creative aging. And Wally's dad wrote the book Creative Aging, and Wally picked up the mantle from his father and made the study of aging part, really, his life purpose, and writing various books about it. So that's kind of a backdrop. Now I'm going to turn to the presentation that I've prepared for today, because regardless of what number of years you live, it's really more about the quality of the things that you do and the life that you make for yourself. So one of the things I thought we would do is we did ask you all to provide a survey, and you did that. I'm going to show those slides because Maya, I want to thank Maya for putting together the summary statistics that we have from these slides. The interesting thing is that this class has a range of people from the age of 18 years old, which is pretty young if you ask me, to be at Stanford, but I guess they're freshmen at Stanford in this class, to in the 30s. So the average age is a little bit under 25. Most people feel their chronological age and their biological age are more or less similar, maybe slightly in some ways older. But most people don't see themselves living to 100. In fact, the range is as low as 70, and there is a high of 103. But the averages are more like in the roughly 88, 89, like that. A slight difference between men and women. Similar health span is expected to be shorter than lifespan. Brain span is expected to be longer than health span, but shorter than lifespan. So obviously people think health span will start failing. Brain span will then start failing, and lifespan will be over. Most people think that work span will be over 50 years, and most people think that retirement years will be under 25 years. This time we had some further questions about how do people think about exercise versus improving their mindsets, their skill sets, and their tool sets over time. Later in the conversation today, I'll talk about what that means for how people are spending their time. And, most people are, getting far less exercise. Maybe that's because classes absorb a lot of their time. They're not spending as much time on improving mindsets. And I had some definitions for that as compared to what they spend improving their skill sets over time. Everyone more or less had a very similar amount of time that they were spent sleeping, although on a monthly basis, although the range was from a high of 275 hours in a given month to as low as 180 hours. And we had some people from the previous class that had a low of something like, 70 hours of sleep in a given month. So the data is all over the place. But it's interesting, how you spend your time is pretty much what's going to define how you spend your life. And now I want to shift to the presentation, because I do have some thoughts about how you choose to spend your time and how you choose to spend your life, and what are ways to think about organizing your time for your life. And I want to make some remarks about that. So I call this 21st century lifestyle management. So it's a little bit about my background, my legal practice at Computer Law Group, as well as Entrepreneur Law Group. We also have a venture firm that's called Florence Ventures, and that's enabled me to create this foundation that provides support for this course called the Foundation for Creativity and Dispute Resolution. We've also created a sub-project that's called the Healthy 100 Years Initiative that's looking at these lifelong health literacy goals which is part of what we're trying to do through this program that Wally has introduced. Very aware that I've wasted some time here, so I'm going to race forward to just talk about this notion of what does it mean to have 100 years? Because as lawyers, we actually track our time on a daily basis. And a healthy 100 years, of course, means 100 years, which of course means 1,200 months, which a lot of people don't calculate into days, but it's 36,500 days. I guess, Len, in a few years, you'll get to this place. In 4 years beyond your 96th birthday, where you will have had 36,500 days. And that will equal something like 876,000 hours over the course of life. Now, a big part of what the previous presentations have been about is how do you try to have a healthy period where the period of health extends further on the path of being a centenarian, as Dr. Hayflick is on the path to doing, or even a super centenarian, where you stay in that green health zone where everyone else in America and throughout the world accelerates after the age often as early as 70 to 75 into the zone of morbidity, where there's far less health, maybe no health span at all, and far more health costs, so far greater amount of medical care. In the ideal world, the cost of medical care as you get older approaches zero because of the care that you provided to yourself. So I like to say a lot of this depends on how you look at the world and how you look at the data. And this is me on the first year of law school, getting my first bank account in California. Back then, they didn't have online banking. We're talking decades ago. They gave you kind of a little identification card. It was just a piece of plastic with your name on it and your account number on it. That bank no longer is in business. That was in Santa Monica. I was going to UCLA Law School. So this presentation is structured around what does it mean to imagine a 21st century hierarchy that extends Dr. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because our physiological needs are fundamentally being met daily. We have enough food, water, our security needs are generally met. Most of our other needs are met. It's more about now our self-fulfillment needs as opposed to our basic needs. So I like to say there's 7 fundamental essences that I found are important to be on the path of improvement and on the path of you helping others to improve. And I put them into these quotients that I call HQ for health quotient, IQ for intelligence quotient, EQ for emotional intelligence, PQ for purpose, AQ for ambition or actualization, FQ for freedom, some people like to call it financial freedom, and then CQ for compassion or community quotient. You know, what are you doing to help the world? So you have 100 years to do it in. Most people think less. And about a third of them are going to be spent in sleep. As the data shows, people are spending in a given month roughly about 1/3 of their day, 8 hours a day, 30 days a month, 240 plus hours. Some people more like 275, some people less, but still mostly sleep. The rest of the time as knowledge workers is being spent in knowledge activities, which obviously there are many types of knowledge activities. Being in school means you're mostly studying and learning from others, but also to some degree creating and thinking about what your future will be over that 100 years. I like to think of it as you really have at least 40 years. Now, Len, you're kind of a counterexample because you've been doing what you've been doing since your 30s and you continue to do it today. So you've put in about 60 years of thought leadership, maybe even going on more like 70 years, right?
Well, yes, I got into the field of aging by accident, as you know. in about the year 1960 and have been in it ever since.
So if you think about it, Len's kind of a good counterexample of what may and probably will apply to each of you, because you will live longer than previous generation. You will have a much longer work span. You're all predicting that you'll have a much longer work span, and you'll have generally a longer lifespan. So I like to think of these quotients as sort of foundational, and the course is foundational to health. But I want to extend the ideas of what does it mean to have lifestyle management principles apply, because they really apply to more than just health. You want to increase your health quotient. Obviously, Dr. Bortz is a big hero in my book, but there are other people too that I've paid a lot of attention to. Dr. Joel Fuhrman, who writes about diet and how important nutrition is. Wally took the counter view to him often. I introduced Wally to Dr. Joel Fuhrman, and Wally disagreed vociferously, saying you can eat anything and it won't matter. And Dr. Joel Fuhrman goes exactly the other way. He calls his major book Eat to Live, as opposed to my Italian family who live to eat. He said you really want to look at nutrition as fundamental and exercise as secondary. Wally took the view that exercise was fundamental and nutrition was secondary. Probably a middle ground between them, and a Stanford grad, is Dr. Peter Attia. He's all over the internet. You can go to YouTube and watch his videos. I recommend it. He has a free podcast at peterattiamd.com. He really says there's a balance between the two, and that although Peter is pretty much a meat eater and believes in high protein, whereas Joel is totally about plants and Wally is about everything. So you've learned during the course of this particular class that Michael Pollan's principles have been impressed upon you. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And, HQ can be thought of as really about nutrition and exercise, but in many ways, I think it's more about happiness. And here's a guy that's 112 years old as of a couple of years ago. I don't know if he's still alive now. He smokes, he drinks. He's America's oldest man, turning 112. He's in a wheelchair, but he's pretty happy. So it may be we're entering the realm less of survival of the fittest and more the survival of the happiest. And a lot of lifestyle management is really then about how do you make yourself more happy over time. And I think a lot of it turns on building more of the other intelligences. So EQ is the second one that I focus on, which is emotional intelligence. And I like to say that you should strive to be sensitive and supportive with others. So you want to be both, sane and sober, get rid of addictions, take care of your mental health. But emotional intelligence is all about serving others and taking care of others and being sensitive and supportive to the needs of others. And I like to cite, and it's a book that's over 100 years old. There's not even a website for him. Dale Carnegie wrote a book about 100 years ago called How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's actually available on Audible. And I listened to it recently, and I thought to myself, Daniel Goleman, who has really popularized emotional intelligence and, of course, has a website, and Chip Conley, who also has popularized through a book that he calls Emotional Equations, this idea of growing your emotional intelligence. They really are leveraging off of principles that Dale Carnegie talked about over 100 years ago. So you can go back to those basic books, not put your head in the sand in the face of people's needs, but really treat your life as something where you're building your emotional intelligence, which is also helping you build your health quotient as well, because the two are related. In fact, I think this data shows that emotional intelligence increases your health quotient. Your EQ increases your HQ. And there's a lot of data that happier people have fewer health problems and live longer. and good relationships reduce stress, and reduce stress reducing hormones. So you really want to try to increase your emotional intelligence over time. And fundamentally, that either happens, either it does or it doesn't on a daily basis, depending on how you react to things. So if you can react or not react to things, you're going to build that. And a lot of what you learn over time that you are all blessed with, because you got into Stanford, so you all have IQ, is you can build your smartness, your measurable IQ, but you also want to build your savviness, which is something Howard Gardner talks about in his books about multiple intelligences. You want to be able to traverse life in a way that enables you to get the best of what's available. Now, here's the exercise I ask people to do, because we're not in a class where we can use a blackboard or a whiteboard, but I'd ask you to take out a piece of paper and a pen. I often jokingly say maybe the first thing to do, and people are going to laugh because I'm going to do it, is take the pen, click it closed, and put the pen in your mouth. I know this is kind of goofy, but if you do it and you put it between your teeth like this, it kind of forces you to smile. So it's a funny exercise, because it turns out that putting a pen in your mouth and putting a smile on your face changes your whole attitude. Now take the pen out and click it open and draw 3 circles as a Venn diagram, because it's going to help you think about some of the other stuff I have to say, which is, a basic Venn diagram looks kind of like a Mickey Mouse thing where basically it's 3 circles in a row. I don't know if this camera is picking it up because I've got a background on, but it's basically 3 overlapping circles. It should look something like this in your pen, in your notebook. So you can put IQ. I put HQ on the bottom because I think it's fundamental. Then I put IQ and EQ, and I think they're all overlapping. So your health quotient, your intelligence quotient, and your emotional intelligence quotient. I have to tell you, by the way, if most of you are unmarried or unattached, those are like the three most immediate things that anyone assesses when they first meet you. They essentially scan to determine, are you healthy? Are you intelligent? Are you emotionally intelligent as well? And those 3 essences that we all possess in one form or another, they overlap with each other. Now, I don't know if you can detect this, but there's at least 4 other areas that now overlap, right? You can see the 4 of the areas kind of look like a lotus. They're just empty. They don't have 2 letters in them, right? And the one in the center, I like to say, is your purpose quotient. That is, when you discover what your life purpose is, you can really supercharge your other essences in a way that produces greater social value and sometimes greater personal wealth as well. So at some point in life, after getting a degree in computer science and working as a computer programmer, I realized that I wanted to study law and that my purpose was to eventually become a lawyer. I didn't know that early on. I went to law school after working for a few years and recognized that I really wanted to study law. And initially I thought I would be a criminal defense lawyer. I worked for a criminal defense lawyer and he convinced me it was probably not my highest calling. And it wasn't something that he recommended I do. There's a funny story about that if we have more time, I would explain it. But fundamentally, it was pretty clear that given my computer science background, it was far more intelligent to move to Silicon Valley and to eventually serve the computer industry clients in Silicon Valley. And once that purpose became clear, I was able to organize things in a way that produced a higher degree of contribution to others, to the people, the products, the processes, the businesses that we enabled ourselves to do. And I found myself being able to enter a state that I call flow, or that Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi calls flow, that really made me happy, as in being able to serve others in the practice of law in a way that supercharged my AQ, which is my ambition to enable startup companies to succeed. So at my very first firm that I joined in Silicon Valley, we literally started Apple Computer. We were the people that filed the corporate articles of formation for Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak to form that company. That firm was then called Davis Stafford, Kelman and Fenwick. It's now called Fenwick and West. I succeeded there to start my own firm that eventually became Computer Law Group. That is the firm that I'm with now and have been for really the last 40 years. So this idea of flow is what you're trying to achieve through the discovery of your purpose and through your pushing yourself out of boredom and really into the zone of anxiety where your skill sets can increase over time. And this gets this whole purpose of, or this whole point of, how do you direct your life in a way that increases your skill set by increasing your willingness to accept anxiety that comes from the challenge of an unknown. So as you take on more challenge, you are pushing yourself to learn faster. And that is really what life is all about. That process of learning through pushing yourself into areas that you're just not sure whether you can master or not. But as you push yourself, you enable yourself to achieve some greater sense of mastery over time. And pushing yourself into that zone should produce a sense of mastery. And there's a lot of psychological writing about this. I know some of the previous presentations mentioned flow in passing. I think fundamentally finding what puts you into flow is really what helps you figure out what your life purpose is. At some point, Leonard, I'm going to ask you whether you found yourself through your laboratory research losing your sense of time and losing your sense of or establishing a sense of immersion in the data such that you were able to get this sense of flow in the course of your research, because you discovered something that no one saw up to that point in time, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Do you want to explain to people how you got there?
Well, I assume you're asking me how I got into the field of aging.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, it was quite by accident. My major interest pre-university life was an interest in chemistry and biology and physics. So I was interested in the science generally, and specifically because they all had the important quality of proof or the requirement for evidence to support belief. And when I was at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia, I headed a laboratory that dealt with cell culture. That is the introduction of tissue from people and animals, small bits of tissue, into glassware and later plasticware, in order to observe the growth of the cells that composed the particular piece of tissue that was inserted. During that period, from the birth of cell culture in the early 1900s, for the first 60 years of that work in that discipline, it was believed that once you put cells in culture, including human cells, they had the capacity to replicate indefinitely, so long as you provided them with proper treatment, proper nutrition, proper temperature of incubation. And so I was taught to believe that. During my work, I decided to look at a phenomenon that was then occurring in the field of cancer biology, and it was determined that there were some laboratory animals that acquired cancer as a result of being exposed to certain viruses. So I did the simple-minded experiment of trying to find out whether some human cancers were caused by viruses, and I decided that the method I would use would be to grow normal human cells in cell culture and expose them to extracts from human cancer tissue. Cancer tissue was easy to obtain from the University of Pennsylvania Hospital, which is across the street from the Wistar Institute. But acquiring normal tissue to have exposed to extracts from cancer cells was more difficult, especially because I wanted tissue from human fetuses. Why? Because it was then becoming apparent that tissue from many human adults contain unwanted viruses that were hiding in the tissue, perhaps not being expressed, but could be expressed when the tissue was put in culture. But that did not occur with tissue from human fetuses. So acquisition of human fetal tissue, of course, was much more difficult. I managed to get a few from the University of Pennsylvania and later from a hospital in Stockholm, Sweden. After culturing the tissue from normal human fetal material, culturing those cells and transferring them, because if you have no experience in tissue culture, you need to know that when you put a tiny piece of tissue into culture, you need to expose it to an enzyme that separates the individual cells from the intact tissue. So a tiny piece of tissue as big as a pinhead may contain many millions of cells that you can release from each other with an enzyme preparation. That enzyme essentially dissolves the mortar that holds all the bricks or the cells together. And then you place those cells in a culture vessel. They land on the floor of a vessel and begin to divide. And when they divide so that they cover the entire floor of the first vessel, in order to increase their numbers, you then have to remove them from the floor of that first vessel, separate them again with the enzyme, and distribute them, for example, equally between two daughter culture vessels. So by powers of two, you increase the number of culture vessels, hence the number of cells. When I did that, as had been done for 60 years previously, although never to the extent that I did it, which means to say that I kept culturing the cells as long as I could, I found that the cells subsequently stopped replicating after about 50 population doublings from the original. And I repeated that experiment many times, proved to myself that it was a real finding. I won't go into the details here. And I suggested that what I was observing, because I ruled out every other explanation for that discovery, that my discovery of the finite replicative capacity of normal human fetal cells might be telling us something about human aging or human longevity, or perhaps both. And that was not immediately accepted. The original paper was rejected by one of the best scientific publishing companies in the country, which was at the Rockefeller Center in New York City. The paper was rejected by them because they didn't believe the results, although the proof was there for all to see. I subsequently resent the paper to another publication in Sweden. It was immediately accepted and published. And if you know anything about scientific publications, you will know that the millions of publications that appear annually receive maybe one or two expressions of acceptance by other people. my original paper published in 1961 and a second follow-up in 63 have now been cited close to 20,000 times. The average paper is cited only 2 or 3 times.
Anyone can go and type into Google Hayflick limit, and you'll find an amazing number of papers. You've essentially created a subdiscipline within the field of biology. But let me ask you, because we're going to turn on this video, there's a big movement, as you know, to push the notion that aging can be reversed and that people can live perhaps to the age of 150 or even 200. And I want to show a short clip and ask you to comment, if you would, on the clip, because I think it's instructive for everyone to know. And I didn't see that any of the prior speakers went down this path, but I think it's useful for the course to mention that there's definitely a group of individuals that are pushing the view that we can reverse the aging process. I mean, reverse it. I think it can be slowed down. Obviously, a lot of what Wally has written, and you're kind of living proof that aging can be slowed down, but can it actually be reversed? And there's a suggestion, particularly by David Sinclair, and he's been on a lot of the various shows, that yes, it can actually be reversed. And I think maybe we'll play a few minutes of this and then get your comments and then take questions from people.
I think it seems much more possible, and in fact, plausible, that we'll make some progress over controlling aging in our lifetime. Now, if you want to slow aging, the first question you need to answer is, why do we age in the first place? I mean, what really is aging? I've made a video in the past about telomeres. These are the end caps on your chromosomes. And every time a cell divides, the telomere gets a bit shorter. So it was thought that these telomeres are kind of like the tips of your shoelaces, and they prevent the chromosome from fraying. But there are other signs in older bodies that you have old cells. There are an accumulation of things that are called senescent cells. They're essentially these zombie-like cells that just go on living in your body and inflaming the cells around them. There's poor intercellular communication. There's mitochondrial dysfunction. Those are the powerhouses of the cell. There are these 8 or 9 different features of older cells, and they are the hallmarks of aging. But the question is, are they the cause of aging, or are they kind of the result of a deeper root cause? In the middle of the last century, the hypothesis was that it was damage to our DNA, mutations to our DNA that happened over the course of our lives that led us to be older. But evidence since then has suggested that that is not really the case. And you can take an adult cell and you can clone it into a new organism. And that organism appears to live about as long as non-cloned organisms of the same species.
Now, the first sheep, Dolly the sheep, had a short lifespan. She died early. But cloned animals, you can now clone a monkey. You can clone dogs. In fact, Barbara Streisand, the actress, she cloned her dogs. And they're expected to live a normal lifespan.
So in that way, it seems like all the information is still there in the DNA. So if we're not losing information in our DNA, then what is the reason for aging? Well, Professor Sinclair suspects that it's a loss of information, but not the information in our DNA, in our genome. No, Professor Sinclair suspects that the loss of information is in our epigenome. So what is the epigenome? Every cell in your body has the same DNA, but different cell types have different epigenomes. They have different ways of packaging that DNA, coiling up, a lot of it so that it's not red, and leaving some parts of the DNA spooled out so it's easier to transcribe and turn into proteins and run that cell. So the epigenome is responsible for turning on or turning off different parts of the DNA. And the way it does that is with proteins called histones that essentially the DNA is wrapped on, and also things like methylation. So there's these chemical signaling markers which are placed on the DNA in certain positions. So the idea is when your body is first forming, the epigenome is what tells your cells what type of cell to be. But as you get older, Professor Sinclair's hypothesis is that we are losing information in the epigenome.
And that's important because if a skin cell needs to remain a skin cell, that's the epigenome. And if you don't have the epigenome, the skin cell will forget what type of cell it is. And it might turn into a brain cell, which may not be that bad, but if your brain turns into a skin cell, you've got a problem. And I think that's largely what aging is.
I gotta say, like, there's some weird, like, hair patches, like, on my shoulder that have happened as I've gotten older. Is that a cell, like, doing the wrong thing? Are those meant to be skin cells? Are they screwing up? Or is this just some, I don't know.
No, weird stuff happens when you get older, right? You start to get hair growing where it shouldn't, ears, nose, back. That's cells losing their identity. Cells go, I can't remember what I'm supposed to do. I'm not reading the right genes anymore.
So the key to this sort of breakdown of the epigenome is DNA damage?
Yeah, so when you go out in the sun, and not like today, but on a day where there's a lot of sun, you'll break your chromosomes. And in the effort that the cells go to stick the chromosome back together, the DNA isn't just flailing around. It's actually bundled up. The cell has to unwrap it, recruit proteins to help, join it together, and then they have to go back and reset the structures. And that resetting of the epigenome happens about 99%. That 1% is the aging process.
So I'll stop here and just ask Len, do you think he's got it right? Do you think Sinclair's got it right? Do you have any remarks about it?
Well, my remarks would be best explained in a couple of hours because the number of errors, misinformation, and false assumptions are too numerous to cover in the short period of time that I have here. First of all, the gentleman whose name I do not know, I've never heard of, who was the host for that program, has no experience in the field whatsoever. He seems to be a reporter.
Right. Yeah, he's a reporter.
And he has received information from many different sources. This fellow has absolutely no good understanding of the field of aging and longevity determination at all. Secondly, Dr. Sinclair, who I know personally and like him as a person very much, is one of many people in this field as of today. At one time in the early 60s, there were less than 10 people in this field, including myself. But why he chooses David Sinclair today from the hundreds of other people in the field who have similar thoughts about aging is very difficult to understand. Choosing one person out of the 100 in the field to emphasize that person's thoughts on aging is very chancy, very difficult. And Sinclair's understanding of the field, in my judgment, is absolutely wrong. First of all, aging is not a problem in biology. It's a problem in physics. Why? Because everything that you can see from where you are presently sitting or standing, or ever will see when you're sitting or standing, will undergo the aging process over a period of time that varies from nanoseconds to billions of years. Aging is a universal physical process that occurs as a result of the second law of thermodynamics, which simply stated means that energy tends to dissipate. So the energy that holds everything together or causes everything to happen essentially over time will dissipate in its strength. There will be an increase, the dissipation of that energy over time, and the loss of function in the molecules that had the energy contained in them initially. So that over time, in humans, for example, we use that as an example, the energy that holds molecules together, the bonds, hydrogen bonds for the most part, will dissipate. The energy will leave those bonds, the bonds will break, and the molecules will become dysfunctional. So over time, that dysfunction occurs in both the repair processes and in the substrate of the repair processes. So over time, function will dissipate. There will be no correction of those changes, and the aging process will occur. Aging is a catabolic process, which means it's a process of destruction, a process of loss of function, as distinguished from longevity determination. Longevity determination is an anabolic process. It's a process of the creation of function. You spend your lifetime from conception to adulthood undergoing all of the anabolic processes that occur in biological pathways to create who you are. And then the aging process becomes paramount. It becomes more, the appearance of dysfunction then becomes greater after the entire program of functionality occurs. So that you can also use your own car as an example. Can you turn your car into a vehicle that will work forever? Will the aging process that occurs in your car, even if you put it up on blocks in your garage and don't drive it, over a long period of time, it will age? There are no instructions in the car's blueprints telling it how to age, just as there are no instructions in your genes telling you how to age. It's not necessary because the second law is a universally applicable physical law and applies to everything, as I indicated earlier, that you can see.
We all know that cars rust, bicycles rust. I mean, when I go to New York City, I always kind of laugh because I look at all these bikes that are locked up. Of course, the wheels have been stolen and the bicycle seat's been taken, but the bike frame itself is kind of like rusting away. And every time I go to New York, I see the same bicycle that's still locked up, and it's still just rusting some more from the process that you're describing that we all sort of see play out over time. So I totally agree with you that there's a limit. And I totally agree with you that at the end of the day, we've got to make the best of what we have of the available time. And the initiative, the Healthy 100 Years Initiative, is meant to say that we should all strive for our health span to equal our lifespan, and for both to meet or exceed 100 years of productive activity designed to give back to the world in some very compassionate way. And that's kind of the point of this. You have to find out what it is that drives your flow in life, what it is that moves you to increase your skill set over time. And your mindset is very much a big part of increasing your skill set so that you can achieve this sense of mastery over time and put yourself into these flow states that really make you feel as though you are creating, because that creative process will create freedom for you and will allow you to reach this higher state of consciousness that I like to say is represented by CQ. You could say it's a compassion quotient, consciousness quotient, community quotient, where you really are engaged in soulful and spiritual activity. So that's kind of the summary of what I have to say about defining and growing your essences, which is broader than just lifestyle medicine broader than just your health quotient, and really even probably broader than each of these 7, which I've defined in some simple way so that you can remember them, because I think all your activities can fundamentally go into one of these categories. So with that, I'll stop and be happy. I'm sure Dr. Hayflick would be happy too, to take questions. I don't know if any came through. We are talking about putting together a scholarship program designed to extend the work of Dr. Bortz. Dr. Bortz was starting to think about other areas besides his Dare to Be 100 and his Live Too Short, Die Too Long view. He was studying things like what he called the metabolic field. At some point, hopefully we'll have some student papers written that may look at Wally's paper in the area of metabolic field, published a number of years ago. That was another book that he was working on that he did not complete. So I don't know if there are questions, Michael or Maya.
Yeah, I was just curious, for those who do want to stay on, they sell a lot of products, and I think Dr. Sinclair is behind some of them, that say that you can lengthen your telomeres. And I was wondering if Dr. Hayflick had any thoughts on that.
The only way that we know telomere increase in length can occur is when a cell becomes a cancer cell. Then the apparatus that reduces the length of centromeres is interrupted, and the centromeres stay static, so that cancer cells do not have telomere attrition. There's no way other than that phenomenon, which is a naturally occurring phenomenon, other than when you purposely try to produce cancer cell populations, which you can't do. But the desire to do that is really the key question. Why would you want to interfere with the shortening of telomeres when that results in the cancer process? That seems to be something we would not want to do, because the telomere lengthening or shortening process has nothing to do with aging. It may have something to do with longevity determination, but it has nothing to do with aging, because aging is a product of physics, as I explained, and has nothing to do with biology.
So these are all false claims then?
Yes, we know of nothing, absolutely nothing that will interfere with the aging process. I challenge anyone on this planet to provide evidence that whatever they are doing in an effort to interrupt the aging process is working. It cannot be done. It has never been done. And I don't know how else I can emphasize that statement.
Well, with that, Maya and Michael, I really appreciate you giving me an hour of your time. Dr. Hayflick, again, Len, I appreciate you participating today. I think you've really enriched the discussion, and hopefully we'll see you all next year. Take care of yourselves through the holidays, and hope you guys all do well in your exams and whatever else is happening through the wrap of the quarter. And I look forward, Michael and Maya, to seeing you again next year.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sounds great. Thank you again for a wonderful.
Take care. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
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 Tune in next time on The Valley Current.